Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our program. My name is Helen Liu, and I'm the Programming and Partnerships Manager at Cary Library. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank the Cary Library Foundation. Their support enables us to bring programs like today's event to you. I'd also like to thank the public libraries in Ashland, Bedford, Needham, and the Peabody Institute Library in Danvers for partnering with us on this program. Today, we welcome Christopher C. Gorham for a presentation on his book, The Confidant, The Untold Story of the Woman Who Helped Win World War II and Shape Modern America. If you have any questions for Chris, please enter them into the Q&A or chat. This program is being recorded and will be posted to the library's YouTube channel. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Christopher C. Gorham holds degrees from the University of Michigan, Tufts University, and Syracuse University College of Law. After practicing law for over a decade, for the last several years, he has taught modern American history at Westford Academy outside of Boston. His writing has appeared in the Washington Post, Literary Hub, Paper Brigade Daily, and online publications. Confidant is his first book. He and his wife, Elizabeth, live in Watertown and Chatham, Massachusetts. Welcome, Christopher. Thanks for joining us again.
Helen, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for everyone who's tuning in and to the Cary Library. I start with a 2-minute book trailer, and then I have slides that guide my presentation. And like Helen said, questions are welcome. So please throw those in the chat as we go forward. But I'm going to share my screen, and we'll start this video.
The New York Times called her one of the most influential women in the country's public affairs for a quarter of a century. Life magazine said she was far and away the most important woman in American government. Her name was Anna Rosenberg, and her story has never been told before.
I came over here from Budapest when I was 8 years old.
She made her own way in a man's world.
They were amazed, they were shocked, they were troubled, but I must say most of them were just a little bewildered.
She was invited into the circle of a couple named Franklin and Eleanor.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
And became an advisor and confidant to a president in peace and war.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
As the Cold War exploded into conflict, she was named to the highest position any woman had ever held in the American military.
Mrs. Rosenberg, wartime envoy of Presidents Roosevelt and Truman.
Then, Joe McCarthy targeted her as a communist.
Where a communist is concerned, she is not a free agent.
That's a goddamn lie.
The Confidant. Coming March 2023.
Thank you again for all being here tonight. Anna's family, that's her in the middle. Anna's family, like so many thousands of European Jews, had reason to leave the old world. In this case, it was due to her father, the man with the white cap there on the right. He was a successful businessman who provided furnishings to Emperor Franz Joseph of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In 1910, after preparing to fulfill his side of the contract, he arrived at one of the palaces to install his installation, and the emperor broke the contract, and in an instant, Albert Lederer was ruined financially, and he realized that his future was not in Budapest, Hungary. He set sail for New York. It took 2 years before he was able to summon for his 2 daughters and his wife, and in those 2 years, Albert Lederer became what Anna called a fiercely patriotic American. He was learning English, he was reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. When the flag fluttered above, would bring tears to his eyes. When his daughters arrived, he took them to the Statue of Liberty so often, Anna thought it was named after her. But most importantly, he realized in his adopted country the importance of an individual being able to have a voice. He instilled these values in his daughter, Anna. And when she arrived, she was enrolled in the public schools of New York City. This is 1912 to 1915. And she became engaged in the two issues of the day, the two largest issues of the day. One was women's right to vote. She marched even as an adolescent, as a teenager. She marched along with tens of thousands of other women on the streets and boulevards of New York City for the right to vote. There's one account which has her holding an American flag that was described as 3 times her size. She was also involved, to the extent she could be, in the other great issue of the day, America's entry into World War I. She sold Liberty bonds from a booth on the street corner of New York. I did the math for the book. It was something in the neighborhood of $100,000 worth of Liberty bonds. And here, as you can see, that's her in the foreground and her sister behind her. Anna volunteered as a Red Cross nurse. She also found herself in the pages of the New York Times for the first time as a 17-year-old junior in high school. The boys' high school was going on strike because the boys didn't want to go to high school and then have to go to compulsory military training. So they looked for someone who could be their advocate. And they'd heard about Anna at the girls' school and her forceful personality. She was described as a Roman candle by one of her classmates. So they had her be their voice. And she mediated her first labor impasse, if you will, even as a teenager, between the boys' high schools of New York and the city leaders. After World War I, it's 1919, and Anna married a veteran of that war, a man named Mike Rosenberg. He had seen the terrible things in the trenches of World War I, and there's evidence, very scant evidence about him going forward, but some of the evidence does point to the fact that he may have had unseen scars, some psychic issues and scars that he found hard to shake. Of course, seeing the trench warfare would do that. But in 1920, the young couple had a son, Thomas. And now it was time for Anna to figure out what she was going to do for a career. And it's at this point she meets two very impactful people. Belle Moskowitz, who is, in essence, the de facto chief of staff of the governor of New York, Al Smith. Belle Moskowitz, on behalf of the governor, was doing something that virtually no woman was doing in the United States at that time: drafting legislation, writing speeches. She was the governor's gatekeeper. She was helping make policy in the most populous and wealthiest state in the Union. She hired Anna Rosenberg to work for Jewish philanthropies, and she was immediately impressed by the young woman. She could not only speak German and Hungarian, but she had an aptitude with large groups of people and for getting things done and done well. She sent Anna a check for her work on one of these big events. It was 3,000 women involved. Anna sent the check back thinking it was gratis, and Belle Moskowitz sent the check back to her along with the note that said, if you don't value your time, nobody else will. Moskowitz also suggested to Anna that she open up a labor mediation office. She was really good at, like I said, large groups of people and coming to solutions that were mutually agreeable. So Anna took that advice and opened up a labor mediation and PR office in Brooklyn. It started modestly, but soon it was gaining client after client. The other very important person she met was a Tammany Hall district leader named Jim Hagan. They met under very interesting circumstances. He was giving a speech against the women's right to vote. Anna and her girlfriends went into the hall, waved away the cigar smoke, and took a seat in the back. During his speech, Anna could take it no more. She stood up and sassed him. But instead of being angry with her, Jim Hagan called her up to the dais at the end of the speech and wound up counseling her and mentoring her for the next 3 years on the retail politics of New York City, how to knock on hundreds of doors and make thousands of phone calls to get your issue acted upon and your candidate elected. This was her sort of political mother and political father. And with this education, and she did not go to college, so this was her education, she took the next step in her career. She always made time for politics. That's what her father had taught her to do. And so she became one of the first women in American history to manage political campaigns, not just aldermen, not just in Albany, but U.S. congressional campaigns. As you can see here, this is a congressional candidate named Theodore Pizer. He, of course, won. We don't know what she's saying to these women in this photograph. She's at the right, Anna is. But I like to think it's women. We now have the right to vote. Let's go out and get our issues acted upon. She was a young mother, a young wife. She was a young businesswoman who always made time for politics. And one media outlet called her at this point in her life the busiest woman in New York. But the most important person that she met was Eleanor Roosevelt. It was 1928. Anna was 28 years old and was attending a Democratic tea hosted by Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt met the young woman, said, "Young lady, what do you do for a living?" She said, "Well, I have a labor mediation office. I do some public relations, and I always make time for politics." Eleanor said, "Well, I'd like you to meet my husband, Franklin. He's running for governor." Days later, Anna found herself on the steps of the Roosevelt townhouse in New York City. And days after that, she was on the team, the governor's race team, along with characters like Jim Farley and Louis Howe and Francis Perkins. What Roosevelt was doing as governor, he won. It was a long shot, but he won. And it was very, very important, maybe the most important election in modern American history, because 9 months after he won, the curtain of the Great Depression fell across the Empire State and the country. But what he did in response was something that nobody was doing. He was creating an energetic response to the catastrophe, putting millions of New Yorkers back to work, back on their feet as best he could, and pioneering dynamic programs like hydroelectricity. This made him the leading candidate in 1932, and of course he won that election for President of the United States. And he scaled up his program that he tried out in New York, and he called it the New Deal. For the New Deal, he needed New Deal officers in his New Deal army. And of course, he remembered Anna Rosenberg and the job she did on his governor's race. Franklin Roosevelt made her the only woman regional director of not one, but two massive New Deal programs, the second of which was Social Security. Without having gone to college, let alone opening a law book, Anna had dozens of lawyers under her command and several field offices. She signed up 6 million New Yorkers to Social Security. Elderly women would say to her, "Well, I can't tell you my real age because my husband doesn't know my real age." And she would say to them, "Uncle Sam and I will keep your secrets." Part of her style at this time was these elaborate hats. She's not wearing one in this photo, but other photos, you'll see it. She loved these very fanciful, elaborate hats. That was her trademark. The president loved to tease her about these hats. In 1938, Anna was back in Washington for a meeting with the Social Security Board when the president wheeled in and said, "Now, Anna, that's a very fine hat you have on today, but I can't tell if you're coming or going." And she said, "Well, Mr. President, that's because it's a New Deal hat." In 1941, with World War II just over the horizon for the United States, this is 6 months before Pearl Harbor, the president found himself in a tremendous bind. He knew that war was coming, and certainly the defense industries knew that war was coming. They were building the tanks, the airplanes, the helmets, and everything else for our allies and for the Americans. The problem was these were good-paying jobs that were only being given to white Americans. The black leader of the day, a man named A. Philip Randolph, said to the White House, "I will march for equality, and I will bring 10,000s of marchers with me to Washington." Even Eleanor Roosevelt was sympathetic with this, but the president was in a bind. He had Southern lawmakers he knew would offer no concessions to the black leadership, but he needed their support for the war effort. Luckily, he knew an ace labor mediator on his staff. That was, of course, Anna Rosenberg. Over 2 weeks in the summer of 1941, he insisted that she be at every meeting in New York City and Washington to try and hammer out a mutually agreeable deal between the black leader and the White House. After 2 weeks, when it looked like hope was lost, she finally thought she had a workable executive order. She had a draft copy in her purse. Now it was time to get the boss to sign it. This is where Eleanor comes in. Eleanor said, "Now, Anna, you love those fancy hats. Go down to Georgetown to one of the boutiques, buy yourself a brand new one, get the confidence up, and come back and get the president to sign it." That's what she did. She got back to the White House that afternoon, spread out the draft executive order on his desk and said, "Sign it, Mr. President, sign it." And he listened. Executive Order 8802, with its watchdog provision, is considered by historians the first federal action on civil rights since Reconstruction. By 1942 and 43, We're in the middle of World War II. I think there's a sense in the United States that the arsenal of democracy was like a light switch that we flipped on. And we flipped on the switch and everything worked well. Chrysler was building the tanks, Ford was building the planes, but it didn't work quite like that. The problem was labor. There was a massive surplus of labor in places like New York and too few workers in places like Portland, Oregon. There was absenteeism. There was a lack of childcare for women workers. There was alcoholism. There was labor piracy from industry to industry. Eleanor Roosevelt went in the newspapers and said the situation is dire. It needs to be fixed. At this point, her husband, Franklin Roosevelt, is referring to Anna Rosenberg in the newspapers as Mrs. Fix-It. He sent her around the country on various problem-solving missions, which she's done time and time again, and now she's ready for her next job, which is to go to Buffalo, New York, the site of this, massive region of factories and war munitions, and they're building they're making medicine, they're building parachutes for our allies and for the Americans, and these defense contractors are nearly 100,000 workers short. Roosevelt says to Anna Rosenberg, "I will make you the labor czar of Buffalo. Go there and fix it." She gets to work. She knows that more women are needed, not just single women, but married women, women with children. Even the grandmothers are going to have to put on the bandana and the coveralls and get to work. But Buffalo had not done any of the logistics. The child care was insufficient, so Anna built that up. Child care facilities. She had the parks opened and heated 24/7. She had movie theaters starting to run all day and night. And she had places where women workers could cash their checks, because previously they'd been going to the tavern at the end of their shift, 3, 4, 5 in the morning. That would never do. She had a place for them to cash or deposit their check that was safe. In the tens of thousands, women signed up for these war jobs. They started punching in and punching back. When Buffalo said, "We will not hire African American workers except for menial labor like painters and porters," she said, "That will not do. This is no time for disunity. We have to show that all hands are on deck." They listened to her. Americans with disabilities took 2,000 of these jobs, and even high schoolers. High school boys would leave high school and pick up the last remaining shifts. Part of this, of course, was moving surplus workers to where they were needed most. And Anna did that because she was based in New York. She had the most surplus workers, and she used them with great skill. Her plan in Time magazine was called the Rosenberg Plan, her plan for labor deployment. Other magazines called it the Buffalo Plan. And like I said, it involved moving workers where they were needed most. She sent tens of thousands of New Yorkers to the docks of the West Coast. One of her workers got back to her and said that the black New Yorkers were not being given the jobs they were promised. They were only giving menial jobs as cooks and porters and things like that. Anna stopped the trains immediately, the trains that were going from New York to the West Coast, and she summoned the union and the management back to New York. And she sorted them out. This is, again, no time for disunity. These black workers should be given the same jobs as the white workers. And they listened. She restarted the trains, and this is how it wound up working. The first Liberty ship, these are massive 477-foot-long transport ships that were crisscrossing the Atlantic. The first one took 131 days to build. After the New Yorkers were on the docks of the West Coast, this is how it worked. The keel of the Robert E. Peary was laid on a Sunday. It set sail 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes later. A woman was there to christen the ship, and she arrived too late. A dock worker yelled out, "Just keep standing there, ma'am. There'll be another one along in a minute." At the end of the war, President Harry Truman said, without the Rosenberg Plan, the arsenal of democracy would not have been able to fire at full bore. When Franklin Roosevelt was at the Navy Department as a young man, he was sent by President Wilson to the trenches of World War I to see about the travails of the doughboys that were then serving. He saw all the things that they would have seen: dead Americans, dead enemy, widows, orphans, ruined villages. And extraordinary and remarkably, when it was his turn in 1944 to send a personal emissary to the battlefields of Europe, he chose a civilian woman, Anna Rosenberg. She was to go there just weeks after D-Day to Nazi-occupied France. In fact, she arrived so soon after D-Day that the troops had not yet broken out from that corner of France with the hedgerows. Her mission was to find out from the GIs what they wanted, what they hoped for when they returned to America. This was the generation of depression and war. And Roosevelt was keen to find out from them what they dreamed, what they wanted from the America they were trying to help save. And over 6 weeks in Europe, as she was embedded with Patton's Third Army, she crossed France with them as they liberated city, town, and village. And she listened to these men over rations. She ate rations off over the hood of a Jeep with them. She listened as they pulled pictures of their sweethearts out of their helmets. And night after night, she wrote down what they said. And at the end of it, it surprised her. And it would later surprise the president. What they wanted was a college education. Sure, they wanted job training when they got home. Sure, they wanted dancing lessons when they got home. But more than that, they wanted something lasting. They wanted a piece of the America they were trying to help save. They wanted a college education. When she returned to Washington after this mission to Europe, the president summoned her immediately for a debrief. Anna said, when I told the president this, his face lit up. And if you look at the provisions that were added onto the Servicemen's Readjustment Act in 1945 and 46 and 47, almost entirely educational in nature. The GI Bill was not perfect, but it was transformative. It elevated millions of Americans into the middle class and helped America achieve post-war prosperity. There aren't too many people that I can think of that would be able to refer to this man, General George S. Patton, as Georgie, but Anna Rosenberg was one of them. General Patton was tremendously fond of her, as were the other generals, Bradley and Eisenhower, but not so much Patton's dog. In fact, when Anna arrived at the forward command post, the dog bit her on the backside. This was at the French border city with Germany of Metz, and Anna was pinned down by German sniper fire at this location, which again tells you that she was not there as a VIP. She was there with the troops, seeing and feeling what they saw and felt. In the spring of 1945, President Roosevelt ordered Anna back to Europe for another mission to work on the demobilization of the troops. He ordered her to do this at the very last lunch he ever ate at the White House. It was just 2 weeks before he died. He was going to go to the train station to head down to Georgia. And he told Anna that he wanted her to go back and do this work. On April 12th, Anna was at the White House preparing to leave for Europe when she found out, along with the rest of America, that the president had suddenly died. President Truman, when he found out about the mission, he said, if the boss wanted you to go on this mission, I want you to go. So off she went. This was April and May of 1945, at the very moment of the implosion of the Nazi state. She arrived in war-torn Europe, and her mission immediately changed. General Eisenhower had liberated the first concentration camps on the Western Front. Eisenhower was aghast at what he saw. He wired Washington, sent congresspeople, sent journalists, sent people to bear witness to these atrocities. Of course, Anna Rosenberg was already there in Europe. She was flown to the Nordhausen camp just days after its liberation. As always, on these 2 trips to Europe, she wore a combination of a woman's army uniform and a man's army uniform, trousers, parachute boots. She climbed out of the Jeep into a hellish scene. Prisoners were still in their striped and ragged uniforms. Anna always carried a woman's purse and a man's briefcase. And as she climbed out, she was approached by some women prisoners. She said they could hardly stand erect. She thought, what can I possibly give them? I don't have food, water, medicine. She reached in her purse and gave one a lipstick, one a compact. To others, she gave a pencil and notepaper. I found only one time that she spoke about this, but it was very profound. She spoke about the insufficiency of the gesture. How could I give women lipsticks and notepaper? But she also said the look on their faces was changed. Someone had given them something back after everything from them had been taken, even their very names. In October of 1945, Anna Rosenberg was made the first American man or woman to receive the Medal of Freedom. We now know it as the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and of course it's been expanded by presidents. But at the beginning, it was for civilians who had helped defeat the enemy in World War II. And she was the very first American so honored. You can see the look of tremendous pride on her face. Anna Rosenberg had met with Franklin Roosevelt something in the neighborhood of 150 times, one-on-one, which is more than most cabinet members. She was a true confidant to FDR during the war. She wasn't quite as close to Harry Truman, but she was a valued advisor to President Truman and again helped him solve multiple issues. In fact, one problem he found himself in was the stubbornly segregated armed forces. He asked Anna to be part of a commission that would prepare a report that would give him the ammunition to make the executive order desegregating the armed forces. What you can see here in his hand is that report, co-authored by Anna Rosenberg. This gave Truman the information he needed to take the courageous move to desegregate the armed forces in the federal government by act of executive order. Anna Rosenberg would in fact become the top woman in the Truman administration. Here's how it happened. The year is 1950. It's 4.5 years after the end of World War II. Anna was back in New York, back with her husband Mike. Her son, who also served in that war, was back safely and helping her rebuild her business. In fact, her son had recently become married. In the autumn of 1950, life was good. Anna had been able to purchase her apartment after renting for decades. Life was good until she opened up a letter on Secretary of Defense stationery. The letter began, "Will you consider an appointment as Assistant Secretary of Defense?" Wow. She knew she couldn't say no to General George C. Marshall, the architect of victory in World War II. But she also knew she had to be honest with him. She said to the general, "I wear the bullseye. I'm Jewish. I'm an immigrant. I'm from Eastern Europe. It's the Cold War. I speak with an accent. I'm pro-union. I'm an ex-New Dealer. They're going to come after me, General, and they're going to come after you." To his credit, the general said, "We will stick through this together." And so they did. The Senate Armed Services Committee unanimously approved her to be the second in command at the Pentagon, and she began her interim appointment immediately. The only thing that lay ahead was a full Senate confirmatory vote, but it was considered just a formality. It's at this point that Senator Joe McCarthy steps onto the stage. McCarthy wanted to prevent Anna Rosenberg from taking this position at the Pentagon. He was not on the Senate Armed Services Committee, but he had allies in the Senate, and he pulled some strings, and he delayed the full Senate vote by 2 weeks. And in those 2 weeks, he conjured up an ugly campaign that would try to portray Anna Rosenberg as a secret communist, as disloyal to her country, as a traitor. The smear campaign hinged on the testimony of one man, a man named Ralph DeSola, a New Yorker who would take the train down to Washington and testified before the Senate that he had seen Anna Rosenberg at a communist cell meeting back in the 1930s. When he arrived in Washington, the Senate Armed Services Committee reopened the hearings and heard him out. DeSola's testimony was almost immediately seen to be untruthful. Under questioning from Senator Lyndon Johnson, Johnson wanted to know how he could possibly be certain that after 20 years, that was the Anna Rosenberg that he had seen in a smoky, crowded communist cell meeting in Lower Manhattan. Of course, when he answered, he couldn't be certain that that was the Anna Rosenberg. When his ex-wife was called to testify, she went off the record. She said, "Senators, my husband has a very difficult time telling the truth." Ex-employers said he has no capacity for veracity. I wouldn't believe a word the man said. And so his story went up in smoke. Now, Anna Rosenberg was there face to face with Ralph DeSola. And of course, she always brought the receipts and did her homework. She had a New York City phone book from that time. And how many Anna Rosenbergs were in it? 47. Sure enough, J. Edgar Hoover found the communist Anna Rosenberg. She was living out in California. But this Anna Rosenberg was a lifelong patriot and true to her country. Unlike so many at this time who were victims of the early years of McCarthyism, particularly many women who were forced out of their careers prematurely, Anna Rosenberg stood up to the bully and actually landed a punch. She emerged from the McCarthy campaign with her career and her integrity intact. She served 26 months at the Pentagon during the Korean War and made 2 trips to the battlefields of Korea. Again, she was not going there as a VIP. She was there to kneel in the dirt with the troops. She would say to them, "Pipe down, fellas, and give me the lowdown." You can see here she's with integrated troops. This is her grandson's favorite photograph of his grandmother. When she first arrived in Korea, one of the journalists said, "How many Black Americans are serving in Korea?" She said, "That's not the question. The question was not how many Black troops are serving in Korea. The question was how many American troops were serving in Korea." When she got back to Washington and found out that the schools on the bases, the military bases in the South, were still stubbornly segregated, that this Black soldier's daughter would have to be bused off base to an inferior school, she wrote a series of letters and spoke a number of times to the Office of Education and got that fixed. It's incredible to think, but the armed forces, both at home and our bases abroad, were fully integrated before the public schools of the country at large, before Brown versus Board of Education. Some of my favorite bits of research were the box of letters between the service members, both men and women, and their families and Secretary Rosenberg. They loved her. She reduced the number of points they needed to come home. She increased combat pay, and she increased provisions for their families they left behind. They thought the world of her. Again, she wasn't there as a VIP. She was there to find out from the troops themselves how they were doing. She was the connection between the commander-in-chief and the troops. She would lift up the lid on the soup pot, make sure the chow was good. She would actually open up the footlocker and make sure the socks were dry and the boots were dry. They respected her for that. They would send her, some units would send her Valentine's cards. Other groups would send her, one unit made her Miss Wolfhound of 1952, where she had to beat out Doris Day and Marilyn Monroe. A mother of a GI wrote her a letter saying, "It was just wonderful for you to go visit Tommy, and I want to send you a ham." Anna wrote back, "I love the sentiments. Please don't send me a ham." Here she is with a man that I'm sure many of you or all of you recognize. This is, of course, Senator Lyndon Johnson. They were longtime friends going back to the mid-1930s, and it looks like they're eyeball to eyeball in this picture. And they are, because Senator Johnson, his job is to keep the military budget in check, and Anna Rosenberg's job at the Pentagon is to make sure that the soldiers and their families have all the provisions that they need. Johnson's trying to give her the Johnson treatment, but it doesn't work too well with Anna Rosenberg. But mostly these two for 35 years saw eye to eye on the great issues of the day, from the New Deal all the way through World War II, all the way through Korea and the Cold War and beyond. The only president who did not utilize Anna Rosenberg to her capabilities was this one. John F. Kennedy considered her more or less a fundraiser. In fact, he called her and her friend Mary Lasker the New York Fat Cats. And this, I want to go back to that photo for a second, because this is all the more incredible when you think that Kennedy had been told by Eleanor Roosevelt herself that Anna would be a perfect woman for his cabinet, either on transportation or on labor. She had name recognition. She was a well-known American, arguably famous American, and she was excellent at what she did, but it was not to be. Kennedy did not have any women on his cabinet, and virtually no women of any decision-making power up and down his administration. It was shameful. Now, Anna, of course, was a loyal American, and she wanted to raise money for Kennedy, which she did. And that included co-hosting the 1962 birthday gala. And that included putting together the entertainers for that birthday party, including, at the very end, the late Marilyn Monroe, who sang happy birthday to the president. When you next look at the video of this black and white video of that birthday gala, the woman sitting, standing, and walking next to the president for the entire evening is Anna Rosenberg. Afterwards, they went to a party after the event. back in New York City, which again Anna co-hosted. And here we see Marilyn Monroe at the party. This was the only photograph of Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, and Marilyn Monroe was taken at this party. Sadly, Marilyn Monroe would live for only about another 70 days before being found dead of an overdose. You see Anna on the right. She is in her office at the Pentagon. And you see what looks like maybe degrees on the wall. These are not degrees. One of them was from a brewers union that said, "Anna, you are tops." She was very fond of these and proudly displayed them. In 1959, the legendary journalist Edward R. Murrow had Anna on his television program, Person to Person. And he asked her about what she faced as a woman in the highest echelons of politics and business, what it was like to be a woman at the Pentagon. He asked her also about her collection of fine china, her collection of French perfume, and of course, he wanted to see some of the hats out of her hat collection. And then he turned to those heroic days, the heroic days of working at the elbow of Franklin Roosevelt during World War II, as the country was fighting a two-front war for its very survival. And after hearing all of this, Edward Murrow said, "Anna, you have quite a book to write someday." And she replied, "Ed, that's a book that will never be written." But here we are 40 years after her death. She died in 1983, and we're sharing this story of a remarkable career, a woman who helped the United States achieve victory in war and prosperity and peace. I hope we've saved some time for question and answer. Thank you again, everyone, for being with me tonight. Thank you to the Carey Library and to Helen for having me. As she might have mentioned at the beginning, I'm a high school history teacher, so I love having questions. So bring the questions on.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chris. And as people start thinking about their questions, can you talk a little bit more about what was your inspiration for writing this book and what was the research process like?
Sure, absolutely. I'm like I said, a history teacher, and it was 5 years ago or so. I was with my students up in the library at Westford Academy, the public high school in that town, and we were launching our research paper. And one of my students wanted to write about an issue related to the Korean War. So I pulled a book off the shelf and I flipped it open. There was a photograph of President Truman with a big smile on his face, and standing next to him with a big smile on her face was a civilian woman. She, was wearing a hat and dress, and the caption at the bottom just stopped me cold. It said, "Anna Rosenberg, Assistant Secretary of Defense," and the year was 1951. And I thought to myself, this is amazing. Here's a woman on great terms with the president. She's in a top position at the Pentagon. It's the early days of the Korean War, which was going badly. And her last name is Rosenberg, which of course was the same surname as the alleged atomic spies that had been arrested by the FBI that same year. So I thought to myself, we need to research this woman. So I said to my kids, write down Anna Rosenberg as a name we can find out more about. A few days later, my student said, "Mr. Gorham, we can't find any books." We found out that her papers, though, had been left at Harvard. So in April of 2019, my wife and I met these students at Harvard Schlesinger Library, and the librarians brought out the boxes and gave us the gloves. And after about 5 minutes, one of my students said, "Mr. Gorham, look at this." It was a citation from President Truman making Anna Rosenberg the first American to be honored with the Medal of Freedom. And then a few minutes after that, I was holding in my hand a business card. It said Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt on one side, and on the back side in handwriting in blue ink, it said, "Dear Anna, when you're next in New York, let's have lunch." It was like I'd been struck by lightning. I thought, I will write this book. And that's when it started, April of 2019.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Carol. Why do you suppose she is not well known today?
Carol, that's a wonderful question. And it starts with really understanding that Anna Rosenberg was a famous person. She was in all the magazines, Time, Life, the Saturday Evening Post, magazines that don't exist anymore. She was in the New York Times from 1917 to 1983 and every decade in between. She was famous. How she lost that fame is really a combination of factors. One, she did not go to college. So you think about Frances Perkins, she went to Penn and Columbia. and those institutions keep her flame lit. But Anna had no such institutions. You also, you saw a picture of her using the telephone. The telephone for Anna had supplanted the pen. She said herself, I issue few memos. I don't do carbons. Those of you who remember what carbons were, she said, when I want to get something done, I pick up the telephone and get it done. So she's kind of a victim of her own success in a way. Another way that she was kind of writing herself out of history was her own disinclination to trumpet her career. She loved it when the journalists would come. She loved having her photograph in the paper, but it was never about her. It was always the commander-in-chief, or it was the service members keeping us safe. It was never about her. And she was asked by, really almost persuaded by Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt sent her a name of a biographer and said, I want you to talk to this guy. And Anna wrote back and said, I will not do that. I'm not interested. And I think part of that, too, is she doubled down in the early 1950s when the Rosenbergs, Ethel and Julius, were arrested in New York. So her natural hesitance about trumpeting her own career, she really doubled down on that. And lastly, she had been told things in the White House and the highest levels of American government, and she thought that those should remain between her and the president, or between her and whoever told her those secrets. She was the confidant first, last, and always. She thought that turning that into a memoir or a book about her service was distasteful. So I think those are the reasons. I think those are the reasons that she's been lost to history, but hopefully events like this will help bring her back to where I think she deserves.
Thank you. And you talked about her friendship with Belle Moskowitz in the very beginning. Was she one of the most influential people in her life? And did she have a mentor that helped guide her throughout her career?
Well, Belle Moskowitz, I would consider one of the early mentors of Anna Rosenberg, certainly. Both Belle Moskowitz and her husband, Dr. Henry Moskowitz, they both knew her. They were both very fond of the younger woman, and really helped her get on her feet as a labor mediator and as someone who was comfortable with public relations, which of course she became, a very, very successful. She had an office on Madison Avenue for many, many years, for decades really, and had big clients like Encyclopedia Britannica. But what's interesting about Belle Moskowitz is what she showed Anna was how to exercise power behind the scenes as a woman. And that was really something that Anna became extremely adept at. She in fact said, when I achieve these solutions for these men, and she said, men working through a woman sometimes gets to solutions easier because men will butt heads like a couple of rams. But if they talk to me, I have the ability sometimes to get them to reach an agreement. Eleanor Roosevelt said Anna Rosenberg could reach solutions before other people realized there was a problem. But Anna said, after I do that, I am content to fade into the background. So she was well aware of her own interest in not being at the forefront of the story, but being, in the background. But her handiwork was out there, both in New York City, in Washington, and the country at large. Now, as for other mentors, I didn't spend a ton of time on him in the book. He is in the book, but Bernard Baruch, who had essentially run the United States economy in World War I, was also a wonderful mentor to Anna. And they would speak to the president together from time to time. So she had a couple of really magnificent mentors that helped her on her career.
Great, thank you. So Chris wants to know, how did Anna get along with FDR's wife, Eleanor, and FDR's secretary/mistress?
Yes. Well, let me take Eleanor first. They had a wonderful correspondence that starts in the mid 1930s and goes all the way until Eleanor Roosevelt's death in the 1962. But it really changes in 1942. From the mid 1930s until 1942, it's formal. It's Mrs. Rosenberg and of course Mrs. Roosevelt. But in 1942, Anna had been told by one of her staffers, who had been reassigned to the Japanese American internment camp, she'd received a letter from the staffer describing just the terrible situation that was. And Anna took that letter and wrote her own letter saying, this is not who we are as a country. This is a bad decision and we shouldn't be doing this. And she wrote both her staffer's letter and her own letter, she sent it to Eleanor Roosevelt at the White House, along with a request that the president see it. Now, Eleanor read the letter. We know that, and it was stamped "seen by the White House," so there's a chance that President Roosevelt himself read the letter. But after that 1942 letter from Anna, Eleanor Roosevelt, for the rest of her life, referred to her in letters as "Dear Anna." After the president died in 1945, their relationship, if anything, got even closer. They were very, very, they cared deeply about each other. They saw eye to eye on everything from, the fairness of the Vietnam draft all the way through, the importance of the United Nations. They saw eye to eye on the great issues of the day. As for Missy LeHand had health issues in 1941. I talked about this in the book, and she was kind of more or less out of the picture. And this was the opportunity where Anna was sort of given a seat at the Roosevelt Roundtable. It was the middle of 1941, so they did not overlap a lot. And in fact, it was Missy LeHand's sort of retirement from that inner circle that opened up a spot for Anna Rosenberg. Of course, very different relationships. I want to be clear on that.
Thank you. And someone asked, great story of how you became aware of Anna Rosenberg. Do you know if there are ways to see more photos of her? Did you include some in your book? I'd love to see some of her hats.
Yes, there are. The hardcover has a photo insert with a number of photos, I think 20 or 22 photos. There apparently is at the Smithsonian, there's a number of these very fanciful hats from the 40s and 50s that you can see at the I think there's a museum of textiles and fashion. But even online, if you just Anna M. Rosenberg, if you do some searches, there's a whole bunch of photographs from the Korean War era, and you'll find some from earlier. But there are photographs in the book, so I would encourage you to go out and find a hardcover and take a look at that photo insert.
Thank you. And Beth wants to know, did she work with Mary McLeod Bethune to fight for civil rights?
I am friends with Jill Watts, who wrote The Black Cabinet, and I tried to find a link between Anna Rosenberg and Mary in The Black Cabinet, because Anna had a lifelong commitment to civil rights. It goes all the way back to New York City, when she would be sitting next to Paul Robeson at a fundraiser, and the first black tugboat captain in New York City, she'd be there at the fundraiser and so forth. This goes all the way through World War II, helping Black Americans not only get the jobs in defense, but helping Truman desegregate the armed forces. And lastly, when President Johnson found himself under fire because Black Americans were being wounded and dying in Vietnam, disproportionate to where they stood in American life, he asked Anna Rosenberg to help him find a way out of that, to make the draft a little more equitable, which she did. That said, I unfortunately didn't find any direct link between the Black Cabinet and Anna Rosenberg, but they, I'm sure, were working towards the same things, maybe in parallel. That's a great question.
Thank you. We have some wonderful comments. This is amazing that she's not better known. Excellent presentation and incredibly interesting. Thank you so much. I will look forward to reading your book. She was a true American hero.
Well, I agree with you on that. I agree with you. Thank you for those kind words. And thank you for being with us tonight to learn more about her. It'll be interesting to see if, in time she gets back to where maybe she was and where she deserves as part of the story of how we won World War II and how we became the country we did in the aftermath.
Oh, can you talk about why you think she was so effective at everything that she did?
She had her grandson, her son Thomas had one son Thomas, and he's a lovely man. He lives hereby in Eastern Massachusetts here. And I asked him, what was the magic of your grandmother? And he said, not only could she get in the halls of power, but she had the social grace to stay there. And as I researched more and more about her, it wasn't just social grace, which of course she had, but she had this ability to make the person she was talking to, whether it was a truck driver who worked for a union back in 1930, or whether it was, literally Nelson Rockefeller, she had the ability to make that person feel like they were the only person who mattered. And she listened to them. She listened to Roosevelt. That's why he wanted her there so many times, because she would internalize this and listen to him and be able to formulate solutions that eluded other people. But it was that just human connection. She had friends and allies that were Democrat, Independent, and Republican. I mentioned Nelson Rockefeller. He was a lifelong Republican, four-time governor of New York State and vice president of the United States. And he said, everything I've ever amounted to in Washington, I owe to Anna Rosenberg. She had friends who were men. She had friends and people who respected her who were women. So she just had this magical ability to, I think it was tied into how she understood democracy. Part of democracy to her meant, we need to treat each other with dignity and with equality. That meant everybody. And she certainly talked the talk and walked the walk.
She sure did. Larry is interested in knowing, what did her husband do?
Mike Rosenberg, there's like I said at the outset, very scant information about him in some cases. He was a rug executive. We know that. He was very quiet, shy, retiring guy. We know that. We also know that he was just really not interested in her life in Washington. This is a very uncommon relationship where, Anna is the breadwinner. She, is in the newspapers and in the magazines. And Mike Rosenberg was just not interested in that part of her life, which is, it's a little bit odd. In 1956, after many years of marriage, 36 years of marriage, she separated from Mike. And in 1962, Anna remarried a man named Paul Hoffman, who'd been the first administrator of the Marshall Plan, and a lifelong Republican. Of course, it was a different Republican at that time. It was an Eisenhower Republican. But they had a wonderful 10 years together before Paul Hoffman's health gave way. So sometimes if you're looking for photographs or info on her, you can type in Anna Rosenberg Hoffman, because that was the obituary from 1983.
And Chris would like to know, I love the picture you showed of her going head to head with LBJ. How tall was she? LBJ was over 6 foot.
Anna Rosenberg was 5'3", petite, and but stood tall. Like I said, when she stopped the trains, when the black New Yorkers were not being hired, I write in the book, it's a little poetic license, but she stood to her full 5'3" and waved and stopped those trains and got that sorted out. She stood tall in some other ways, though.
Steve wants to know, how did she manage to escape McCarthy's smear in the Red Scare when so many were brought down?
Anna was tough as a $2 steak. I mean, there were many women whose careers were ended prematurely in the first couple years of McCarthyism. What helped Anna was her courage and strength. She wrote Eleanor Roosevelt about this traumatic ordeal. She said, we have enemies without, foreign enemies, and we have very dangerous enemies within. She knew that. She was not one to complain about the anti-Semitism that she faced, or the anti-Semitism masquerading as anti-communism. She was willing to go back down to Washington, have them reopen these hearings, and go face to face with her accuser, which she did. She also, I want to say, and it's connected to a previous response of mine, she had a stack of letters in her favor from leaders in business, the military, and politics, people that sat on boards, people that owned massive, huge companies. And those letters were written by not just Democrats, but Republicans as well. So she had friends and allies across the political spectrum. But it was her inner strength, too, that helped her weather that trauma and weather that ordeal.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your research on Anna Rosenberg. It's been fascinating to learn all about her life. So what's next for you, Chris?
Well, I'm continuing to write about World War II. I have a true narrative history that I'm working on. It takes place in occupied France. It involves some people that I think readers will find heroic under the circumstances. And I'm very excited to be working on it and very excited for it to come out in the second half of 2025.
Great. Thank you so much. We look forward to reading it. Thank you so much for joining us today, Chris. And thank you
you all for
everyone for
having me.
joining us.
Bye-bye.